For as long as I can remember, I have been homesick for wildness. I have longed to travel to distant lands, to escape civilization, to be footloose and fancy-free. I have an Austrian mum and an English dad, and whilst we couldn't afford holidays growing up, I always lived between two cultures, countries, and languages, which instilled in me a deep fascination for different peoples and places. And so, ever since I turned 18, I have on and off been living and working in different countries across the globe, from volunteering in Ghana, climbing Mount Kilimanjaro in Tanzania, working as an environmentalist in China, being a carer in the US, doing a work and holiday visa in Australia, camping and hiking 10 weeks in Indonesia, and more recently doing workaway in Europe. I'm supposed to say that I enjoyed every moment, that traveling transformed me, that it was the best time of my life. But in this video, I want to talk about why the opposite is actually the case. Why, in hindsight, I regret a lot of my travels, and why traveling is kind of overrated. One of my primary motivations for traveling was escapism from the daily rat race and drudgery of capitalism, with its cost of living crisis, overwork, and existential emptiness. In general, traveling has become the go-to panacea for any problems we have in life. Hate your job, hate society, feel isolated and lonely, go travel, explore the world, find yourself. Rather than questioning why modern life is such that so many of us feel the need to escape from it, the privileged amongst us can opt out or take a break from the system rather than challenging it. We can then return home to our conventional lives, more comfortable to accept these conditions because we've had a rest from conformist life, taken a stroll in counterculture, seen how other people in poorer nations have it worse, so we feel better about our shitty lives. We normalize that freedom, fun, and joy are to be relegated to the confines of a travel experience, and are therefore more ready to accept home societies that are suffocating, soulless, and miserable. Essentially, it's a very individualistic, privileged, and temporary form of liberation. Problems that used to be solved via unionizing, organizing, and agitating can now be solved for a minority of us via a light travel excursion. Meanwhile, the poorest at home and abroad never get the opportunity to escape the brutality of their lives. This was the point that was made in The Small Place, a book that explores how Indigenous people view travelers, that draws on the author's experiences growing up in Antigua. That the native does not like the tourist is not hard to explain. For every native of every place is a potential tourist, and every tourist is a native of somewhere. Every native everywhere lives a life of overwhelming and crushing banality and boredom and desperation and depression, and every deed, good and bad, is an attempt to forget this. Every native would like to find a way out. Every native would like a rest. Every native would like a tour, but some natives, most natives in the world, cannot go anywhere. They are too poor. They are too poor to go anywhere. They are too poor to escape the reality of their lives, and they are too poor to live properly in the place they live, which is the very place you, the tourist, want to go. So when the natives see you, the tourist, they envy you. They envy your ability to leave your own banality and boredom. They envy your ability to turn their own banality and boredom into a source of pleasure for yourself. Of course, sometimes escapism is natural, necessary, and understandable, but we really have to question the ethics of that escapism if it's based off of the suffering of others, has a pacifying effect on society, and blunts the edges of political resistance. Traveling is presented as having unique transformational power. It's supposed to help us grow, self-actualize, and step out of our comfort zones. However, in my experience, traveling seems to be an extension of what people do in their everyday lives. The desire to meet other people and learn from other cultures is rarely fulfilled, as most of us seclude ourselves in hostel or Airbnb bubbles with other privileged white Westerners, using a whole host of traveling services dedicated to our needs, like car hires or tour guides. Most tourism spots have the familiar comforts of home. My friends and I would always go to Starbucks in Shanghai and Burger King in Africa. The internet also insulates us from the foreignness of a new place. I'd be strolling through Indonesia, guided by Google Maps, never having to learn the local language because everyone speaks English and I can just use Google Translate. We say we want to travel to become different people, but the process of becoming different is rarely about genuine growth. It's more about adopting various elements of the material culture of backpacking. Hippie clothes, having loads of sex in hostels, taking drugs, or buying destination markers that show where we have been traveling. As I was editing, I was also thinking about how, rather than genuine cross-cultural exchange, many of us return home with cliché, often problematic notions of people abroad. I remember spouting racist stereotypes about happy, pure Africans despite their poverty and exotic Latin men. For most people I know who have travelled, including myself, travelling seems to generate very little shift in our consciousnesses, deep introspection, reflection, or any real challenge to our worldviews. And we are so inculcated with notions of white Western exceptionalism that many of us, if we're honest, don't really go to learn from others. We go to reaffirm why we are superior. Looking back, it also seems strange to me that so many of us feel the need to go abroad to engage with other peoples and cultures and to transform ourselves when we could just as easily do that at home if we stepped outside of our bubbles. I, for example, think the challenges of waitressing, activist groups, and countless books have done more to shift my perspective and help in my self-actualization, and I've met far more interesting people in protests, political groups, and whilst volunteering than I ever did whilst travelling. In fact, when I meet other travellers, no matter where they are from, they always seem to be the same kind of people I met at my elitist university, white, middle-class Westerners. That's not to say travelling can never help us learn and grow, but the way that I travelled and the way I see most people travel today means that rather than helping us transform ourselves, travelling becomes a way to reproduce already held values, worldviews, and ways of being. We live in the age of the experience economy, where we are exhorted to define ourselves and our worth through meaningful and valued experiences. We feel cajoled into an ongoing and anxiety-inducing cycle of experience acquisition. This means that most travellers spend time going through a checklist of must-see and must-do activities that we just have to check off our to-do lists. So contrary to the idea that we follow our hearts and dreams when we are travelling and look deep within ourselves for what we truly desire. We all just adopt the socially prescriptive blueprint of where, what, and how to do traveling meaningfully. Everyone's visiting the same landmarks, going to the same restaurants, expected to have the same exact emotions at the exact same moments. I, for example, remember working in the US when I was 19, and before I left, I just had to go to Las Vegas. I was too young to gamble or drink or go to clubs, so there was essentially nothing for me to do there. But I went because that's what you're supposed to do when you're in the US. If it were simply a case of us wanting to see a few key places in the world, then maybe checklist travel wouldn't be so bad. But the profit motive under capitalism means that travel industries must keep us in a constant state of experience hunger. So no matter how much we have done before, nothing is ever good enough. There's always more places to see, new things to add to our checklists. This can lead to a situation where we're never really satisfied with the travel experiences we have, because there's always the idea that there's something better elsewhere. In Cairo, dreaming of Baghdad. In Baghdad, dreaming of Cairo. At the same time, the more experiences we try to cram into our jam-packed schedules, the less likely we are to actually be present or genuinely enjoy the places we are visiting. Traveling can become just as exhausting as work, and trying to maximize every moment can just ruin the experience altogether. That's why many people have found that places like Uluru in Australia are actually kind of meh. You're trying to force a profound experience and you have such high expectations, which ultimately just leads to disappointment. On the other hand, the days in life that are the most beautiful are often the most unplanned and unexpected. When I reflect on my most enriching, sacred, and meaningful memories, I don't really think of travel. I tend to think of experiences much closer to home. Deep conversations with friends, going for a nighttime walk, running around the garden with my dog, watching the vegetables grow in my communal vegetable garden. But when I was younger, by fetishizing distant lands and major experiences, I became dismissive of these humble moments and places. Beauty, exploration, and adventure was relegated to the remote corners of the planet, not something all around me in the here and now. So in the end, rather than making us happier, checklist travel can actually make us more miserable, because by fetishizing distant lands and major events, we adopt too high a standard of what counts as a meaningful experience. Idealizing distant lands too often means not idealizing the places in which we live. So often these days, I see that travel isn't valued in and of itself. It's only valued so long as it doesn't damage and preferably enhances ourselves and our job prospects. This is because under a capitalist system, we are constantly pushed to value productivity, efficiency, and self-optimization to such an extent that we start to feel pressure to use our leisure time productively too. The anthropologist Ilana Gershon writes, "Under neoliberal capitalism, one owns oneself as though one is a business, a collection of skills, assets, and alliances that must be continually maintained and enhanced." In this context, it can become difficult to enjoy time off without regard for any potential future benefits, because time off that doesn't have instrumental value is seen as wasteful. So many of us end up traveling not because we really want to, but so we can feel we are improving ourselves, adding to our resumes, and maximizing life. If I'm really honest with myself, my desire to volunteer in Ghana or intern in Shanghai was less about exploring these places and doing some good in the world, and more about gaining market advantage over other job applicants. And I often think I was motivated to travel by a desire to form and perform an identity as an adventurous, interesting person, distinct from all those other normies who never leave their homes, or as a way to gain social and cultural capital by displaying myself as part of the privileged group of people that can access travel. And I'm often so desperate not to end up regretting my life that I often ended up traveling not out of the genuine joy of seeing the world, but out of an anxious desire to reassure myself that my life had some value. The anti-self-help author Oliver Burkeman was making this point when he wrote that you could be traveling not because you genuinely want to explore the world, but a subtle distinction this, to add to your mental storehouse of experiences in the hope that you will feel later on that you had used your life well. Whilst there isn't necessarily anything inherently wrong with using travel productively, to me this is just another example of how capitalism co-opts the liberatory potential in everything. We are encouraged not to travel out of genuine joy or connecting to local people and land or seeing different visions of what societies could be, but instead to further entrench capitalist values of toxic individualism, work obsession, and becoming passive, obedient members of society. Whenever I talk to people about all the problems I have with traveling, the usual response is, well, you're just not doing it right. That isn't real traveling. There seems to be a pervasive idea that there are authentic and inauthentic ways of traveling. The authentic travelers like to position themselves as not like other travelers. They like to go off the beaten track in places uncontaminated by other travelers or the tourism industry. Some even refuse to visit top tourist destinations like the Northern Lights so they can avoid other tourists. They often complain about places being too touristy, not realizing they are one of said tourists. I am, however, increasingly skeptical to what extent authentic travel is really possible. Since tourism is a highly lucrative industry, any genuinely authentic places soon get taken over by capitalists' relentless drive to find new profitable markets, expand and globalize. Every land, ocean floor, even outer space, is becoming a consumer product in the interest of capital. Rather than remaining authentic, these places are becoming McDonaldized, coming to look like a clone of each other, more like an airport or a shopping arcade. Everywhere they went, they turned it into England, and everybody they met, they turned English. To make these areas as enticing to travellers as possible, everything from food to infrastructure to culture is geared towards meeting the preferences of rich white Westerners. In fact, local cultures are often staged in what comes to be known as tourist theatres to make them as profitable and digestible to travellers. Whilst volunteering in an orphanage in Ghana, I found out that the orphanage was staged in a tourist hotspot, intentionally subjecting the children to inhumane conditions in order to get tourists to pity them and donate more money. And in Australia, I learned that the colonial history and ways of life of Indigenous peoples is largely erased from view because the truth is too affronting and offensive for white people to bear. Mass gentrification from tourist accommodation, where locals are pushed out to make room for Airbnbs or hotels, also destroys the authenticity of travel destinations. This is a form of cultural imperialism where the ways of life, cultures, and histories of Indigenous populations are taken over by white Western values. I'm currently living in Barcelona, and many people seem to come here for the charm of the Mediterranean way of life. But gentrification means that in reality, you're mostly just experiencing the way of life of a bunch of tourists. Similarly, people go to Bali to experience the traditional Balinese way of life, but most Balinese locals have jobs exclusively as servants to white people. In a typical colonial master-slave dynamic, there is nothing traditional or authentic about it. Nature travel is also extremely popular. Travelers want to experience untouched, pure wilderness in distant lands. But what is natural, pure, or untouched about sacred Indigenous land plundered, from which people are evicted to make room for tourist national parks and general tourist expansion? And travelers may experience a simulation of interacting with wildlife via visiting a monkey park, when in reality these animals have been caged, abused, drugged, and exploited. In other words, the combined forces of capitalism and colonialism makes authentic travel to find something genuine, unchanged, and undiscovered increasingly difficult. As David Foster Wallace put it in Remember the Lobster, to be a mass tourist is to spoil the very unspoiledness you are there to experience, to impose yourself on places that in all non-economic ways would be better, realer without you. On top of that, by labeling ourselves as authentic travelers and imagining we are somehow superior to or different from other travelers, to what extent do we give ourselves permission to evade our own complicity in continued exploitative relations between travelers and local peoples and lands? To call ourselves not like other travelers can be a very convenient means to distance ourselves from taking responsibility and accountability for our own contribution to systems of oppression. I've been incredibly critical of travel in this video, so I do want to make clear I don't think traveling is inherently bad. In fact, I think it can be powerful to experience other ways of being, of organizing societies, of interacting with the earth, other possibilities that broaden horizons and challenge our worldview. What I regret is not travel itself, but the fact that the way that I traveled was so infused with a capitalist, consumerist, colonial mindset that I could have traveled to every inch of the planet and been no better off for it. I also think it's important to add here that, as I've been trying to show in this video, it's not just that the way I travelled and the way I see most people travel today has a colonial capitalist mindset. It's also that this is a form of modern day colonialism and capitalist expansion because it's cannibalizing cultures, communities, and lands. And it's adhering to the capitalist project of experience acquisition, efficiency, productivity, and narcissistic fixation on the self, centering ourselves at the expense of local peoples and places. So before traveling, if you want to avoid the mistakes that I made, I'd encourage you to ask yourselves, why are you traveling? What are your true motivations? Could you gain the same things in your own country? Are you seeking to muffle the inner voice that asks the most difficult questions? Are you trying to solve systemic, spiritual, or existential problems that could be better solved elsewhere? And how are you traveling? Are you doing so in a way that is respectful to local land and peoples? Is your traveling inculcated by a productivity mindset and checklist travel? Are you genuinely interested in learning from others, or are you trying to reaffirm already held beliefs? Is where you're traveling genuinely authentic or simply colonized, McDonaldized, and centered around capitalist profiteering? I now believe so much truth lies in Marcel Proust's statement that the voyage of discovery lies not in finding new landscapes, but in having new eyes. We don't see things as they are, we tend to see things as we are. If you are born into white Western privilege like me, we have our entire worldviews, ways of being, and values normalized, naturalized, and universalized to such an extent that we don't even think to question them. We essentially live our lives with blinkers on. Our entire cosmologies are obscured and limited. So I think the true voyage of discovery lies in decolonizing our mindsets from white supremacist, capitalist, patriarchal conditioning by critically examining our entrenched values, worldviews, thoughts, narratives presented as the norm. Deeply listening and learning from other beings whose experiences are different from our own, and working to transform oppressive systems and build liberatory alternatives in their wake. I also think having new eyes applies to how we view our homes too. Instead of escaping, consuming experiences, always striving for more, never satiated, being content to just exist and savor the here and now, seeing beauty and wonder all around us, not just relegated to distant places, learning our histories, connecting to our local lands and communities, and recognizing our important roles in them. I want to be clear, I haven't mastered any of this stuff. I made this video as much for myself as for anyone else. That being said, so far, to me, this voyage of discovery has been far more fulfilling and rewarding than simply finding new landscapes. If you liked this video, you might like my video on my volunteerism experience in Ghana and why I now vehemently disagree with volunteerism. I also have a bi-weekly Patreon podcast, and in the last one, I talked about my life over the past 2 years as a digital nomad and doing workaway. If you'd like to listen to that, I'll link it in the description box. The hardest part of this lifestyle is definitely the loneliness that comes from never having enough time to form deep friendships and community. So I often find myself craving the physical touch of someone that loves me and end up resorting to all these unhealthy coping strategies just to get that need filled. I also co-host a Discord call bi-weekly with Mixie, where we discuss topics decided on by the Patreon community, and the next one will be about travelling and our reflections on travel experiences. I've linked that on my Patreon in the description box below. These videos take an enormous amount of time, energy, and resources to create, so if you would like to see more, I'd really appreciate if you could consider becoming a patron or leaving a one-time donation via Ko-fi or PayPal. Thank you so much to my current patrons for helping make these videos possible. I appreciate you encouraging and supporting me and helping me to continue to make videos. I couldn't do it without you. Thank you.